So, stemming off of the social learning um, ideas about desistance, there are people who, from the social learning perspective, and people from the kind of age graded informal social control perspective, really butt heads on what it is about social bonds that make them so crucial for desistance. Because we know that they are. We know that social bonding in adulthood is a really important part of people committing crime. But not everyone agrees on why this is the case. So, a couple things that social bonds do that forming, high quality bonds to things like your family, your spouse, your job, things like that might do to you. In one way, from a social control perspective, social bonds are important because they add stakes in conformity. This idea that's gotten tossed around in the control literature for a while really does seem like it's quite valid. That when you're bonded to things in adulthood, you have more of a stake in kind of pro-social normal life, and you don't want to risk giving that up. Adult social bonds can also be important because they can help you kind of change your identity. If you see yourself more as a husband, a father, an employee at this firm, it might help you to see yourself less as somebody who is a criminal, a delinquent, an offender. Adult social bonds can also be influential in terms of changing your calculation of the costs and benefits of committing crime. And all of these things kind of are related to each other. But if you think about when you're an adult and you have a family, the costs of committing crime might really start to outweigh any benefits that you might foresee in committing individual offenses. There are some people who suggest that social bonds can also help to alter your level of self-control. So this thing that Gottfredson and Hershey talked about, self-control, that they argue is time stable. Not everyone agrees on that, and some people argue that if you have the ability to bond really positively socially in adulthood, that could actually help your impulsivity and help your risk taking and your aggressiveness and things like that. So not everyone agrees that it's this time stable trait, but that social bonds can actually help it. And we know that even people who do form strong social bonds don't all do it in the same way. There's a lot of variation by age, by race, by gender in not only people's maybe ability to form social bonds, but in the type and quality of the social bonds that they are able sometimes to form. So the marriage issue is something that criminologists have talked about quite a bit in the desistance literature because it's one of those things that, starting back with Sampson and Lobb, a lot of men cited as being a big reason why they stopped committing crime, that they got married. But again, if you think about marriage and what getting married actually entails, the reasons why marriage might be related to desistance might not everyone necessarily agrees on what those reasons are. So, from a control perspective, getting married is a good thing and it leads to desistance because you're strengthening social bonds in adulthood. If you have a spouse who you love, who you care about, who you want to be a better person for, that could be a very strong reason for you not committing crime. And that's a control argument, that this person is exerting informal social control over you. Not in a bad way, but they're helping you to kind of form investments, form bonds in things that are not criminal. Sampson and Lobb would be people that would agree with this, that marriage is a transition in a person's life that can be a turning point if the quality of that relationship is strong. Again, and it's all about the quality. Just getting married isn't enough, because if you don't really care about this person, if you're not really invested in the marriage, it's not going to have the same kind of effect. But for them, if you have a strong quality partnership, if you care a lot, if you love your spouse, if you want to be a better person for them, that can be a big reason why you might desist from crime. And more recently, from their original theory, they collaborated with a few other scholars to talk about the difference between a good marriage and a bad marriage. In other words, having a really good marriage. And by that they mean a marriage where the two partners are very invested and attached to each other is something that over time is associated with decline over time. So they went back into their data and looked at the people who got married, and they specifically went back and talked to them about the quality of the marriage to try to figure this out. Interestingly enough, they even found that for very high rate, very chronic offenders, the people that spent the majority of their childhood and adolescence and young adulthood committing crime, good marriage was enough to really hasten their decline in offending. So again, it's interesting because it's this very high risk population, and the idea that something as well, not simple, but something like getting married could be enough to decline to hasten their desistance was something that's very encouraging. But not everyone agrees that the reason that marriage matters is a control reason. So, a sociologist named Mark War is someone who kind of took this idea that marriage leads to desistance and says, well, maybe it's not just about social control. Maybe it's not just about forming a bond with your spouse and that being a reason for you to not commit crime. So, Mark War is someone who is approaching this relationship from much more of a social learning perspective. And he makes the argument that when a person gets married, a lot of things socially change for them. I mean, not a whole lot of you are married, but think about one of the big things that men especially talk about as changing in their lives after they get married. Specifically, not being able to have time to hang out with their buddies, their friends, as much as they used to. So, one thing that marriage does, in addition to strengthening a bond with a spouse, is a transition away from heavy interactions with former friends. And one thing we know about offending is people tend to commit crime with their friends. Crime tends to be somewhat of a group phenomenon. So, Mark War's idea is maybe getting married, the fact that getting married leads to desistance doesn't have as much to do with the spouse's attachment as it does the fact that the spouse is not enabling you to be in the same social patterns that you used to be. So, according to Mark War, marriage is much more important because of the opportunities that get reduced as a result of it. If you get married, you can't go out with your buddies to the bar every night. You can't do whatever you want on the weekend. You have kind of an obligation, some people more than others, to spend a lot of time with your spouse. And for him, that's going to not only reduce the opportunities that you have, but it's going to reduce your motivation over time to engage in criminal activity. The less contact you have with your friends, the higher quality of the marriage and the less crime over time. That's the relationship that Mark War thinks is going on. That having less significant contact with your friends means you're going to strengthen your contact with your spouse, have a higher quality marriage, and that's going to be what's leading you to less crime over time. A couple other things that people have talked about in terms of desistance have to do with processes that a person can go through that might help them speed up, enable them to desist in a more successful manner. And one thing that people have been interested in crim research is, does spirituality have anything to do with a person's ability to desist? Does all of a sudden becoming more religious, finding a new religion, have anything to do with a better desistance process? And if you think about it, that's really compatible with a control idea, because hypothetically what the religion is doing, whatever religion it is strengthening your bond to that religion, to that way of life, to those practices. And if you have that, that's going to control you, that's going to protect you from wanting to commit crime. So some people have actually looked at this, gone into look at people who experience some kind of a religious change amidst the desistance process to see if it does make a difference. Peggy Giordano, who we talked about earlier in this semester with her research on peers, has also done work looking at this, looking at spirituality and desistance. And what she did is she measured religious participation in terms of, are you a member of a church? Do you go to church frequently? Have you experienced a change, an increase in your religious practices? She tried to kind of measure participation in a number of different ways. And one thing she found is religious participation doesn't really predict whether someone is going to be able to be a stable desister in her mind. So essentially what she found is people who were successful, who were stable desisters, some of them had religious changes, some of them didn't. There didn't seem to be much of a relationship between the two. But what she thought was interesting is a lot of people who she talked to believe that their spirituality has helped, even though in some cases it doesn't show up in the numbers. A lot of people's perception of their spirituality is that it has been a helpful factor. And what she really attributes, the majority of the desistance explanation to is basically other non-religious factors. And her argument is these non-religious factors, things like bonding with control learning kind of variables other than religion really seem to like they're more important. And for the most part, she kind of talks about the fact that in really disadvantaged communities where things like forming bonds, forming strong networks is less likely, people, even who are able to have some kind of a change in their religiosity, are really going to be very disadvantaged and unlikely to be successful as a stable desister, as someone who gradually over time stops committing crime.